Guys, hope you're well. Okay, so I wanted to do a video today in regards to the authenticity of the modern traditional witchcraft tradition and just kind of where it kind of stands upon that. And I think, and well, first things first, I think in general, just in the whole witchcraft movement, there tends to be this romanticised idea of an unbroken chain of lineage that's happened and occurred, that's been passed from family member to family member, and I think we quite like the idea of an unbroken chain of witchcraft. However, most of you know that's highly unlikely and that doesn't occur. In the modern day it will now. You know, people's mums will be witches, and possibly people's nans will be witches now as well. And I'm not disputing, you know, that we have the kind of granny story thing where everybody says, oh yes, my nan was a witch and she taught me, and we kind of have this a lot, and a lot of people now find that if their nan was actually practicing witchcraft, they tend not to say because they find it a little bit embarrassing, because it's that sort of granny story, sort of cliche thing. And it's also probably the fear of people thinking that they are completely and utterly bullshitting. Now, of course, there are magical traditions where people's nans and grandfathers will have been involved in that. And for instance, even in the West Country still, you will hear people saying, oh, my granddad knows how to stop blood. My granddad knows how to charm away wars. My granddad can cure headaches and stuff like this. So we do still get this. We get this era of what used to be. Now, in terms of the actual authenticity of traditional witchcraft today, now, I mean, a lot of people tend to have the belief that modern traditional witchcraft has ripped off a lot of its methods from Wicca. However, on the situation, I stand sort of at both sides, and I can see why a lot of people would think that. However, bear in mind that Gerald Gardner, when he was creating Wicca, not a lot of things, but some of the things in Wicca are taken from witch trials, and a lot of the ideas are taken from old world witchcraft. So bear that in mind. So it may be that it is actually the other way around. Traditional witchcraft in general, a lot of people have this idea that the compass round was created by Robert Cochrane. However, I've been doing a little bit of research and that's actually not the case. It will be hard to find, but try and see if you can attempt to find it. If I find the link, I will put it down. There is a witch trial of Andrew Man, and it speaks about the compass round. It speaks all about the compass round, about having the devil in the compass and putting a light on the compass edge and stuff like that. Now, this is at least a couple of 100 years old. So, to me, this is proof that the compass round isn't just a creation of Robert Cochrane or Roy Bowers. This is actually something that's a lot older. Yes, of course, it's not going to be the, you know, word for word original, you know, we don't have this unbroken compass round. And what you have to also bear in mind with, a lot of modern traditional witchcraft does take from the witch trials. A lot of it does take from the testaments and confessions of the witches. Though, as one of my friends pointed out, if you are to be in immense torture and, you know, you have secrets, you will take to your, you know, you will take to your grave and you won't tell anybody. You will make up any old shit to stop that torture, but not necessarily tell the secrets. So, of course, it could all be a load of baloney, what people have said in the witch trials. And it may have been, but there have been some witch trials where they've actually caught some witches, and some witches have actually, you know, and these are people that a lot of strange things have happened around the circumstances when they've had these witches under investigation and stuff like that. Now, what you need to remember is they may not necessarily be right, or they may not necessarily be correct witchcraft rituals, though I do believe that some of them are genuine, real witchcraft spells and charms. I do believe that. But what you have to remember is, even if they're not real, if they're released and people see them, a lot of power will be put into that. A lot of people will fear that and put power into that. So of course, if anybody here is watching, if you are a genuine good magician, you will know that people have the ability to put power into things, to empower things. So you have to remember, this is at least 100 years, well, at the very least, of people putting power into something that may have not in the first place originally had power to it, but now it sure as hell does. So, you know, that's what we have to remember. Now, of course, there are things in modern traditional witchcraft that we have no record of happening in the witch trials. For instance, in terms of treading the mill, that's not, as far to my knowledge. If anybody knows different, let me know, because it'd be really interesting to see. But that's not actually referenced in the witch trials. However, a lot of people have taken from examples of this. In traditional witchcraft, we incorporate a compass, we incorporate a stang, even, not compass, we incorporate a stang into our work. And if you look at old depictions of witches, the stang is there, and it shows the usage of the stang. It also shows in wood carvings where witches are dancing around the centre, you know, with the stang in the centre, and they're dancing around it back to back. Stuff like this still occurs, it still happens. You know, this isn't, I'm not saying this is an unbroken thing, but this is what witches have been depicted to do, and may have well done. And so what you need to remember is that it's, you know, witches will still do this. You know, this is a thing witches still do. Again, the compass round, it's not going to be an unbroken ritual that's gone through ages upon ages upon ages, such as the Christian or the Catholic Mass. However, even in terms of Christianity, it wouldn't have been the same as it was back then. In some parts of this country, early Christians were believed to believe in reincarnation, and early Christian women would pray to the moon when they were on their period. That doesn't happen now to the majority of Christians. Of course, everybody has their own beliefs. But what I'm trying to say here is, even with a very mainstream, a very popular, so to speak, religion, such as Christianity, the rituals aren't specifically the same, and they aren't that unbroken. There are things that would have happened way back that don't now. That's pretty much the same with traditional witchcraft. In terms of the charms and spells that we do, a lot of the charms and spells we do, we look back into history. We will look into old historical folk magic, witch trials, confessions, in particular as well, cunning folk. Yes, the majority of cunning folk would have killed you at the idea of them being called or labelled witches. To be called a witch would not be a good thing. It's only the past couple of years that people have really found power in this word. And also the translation of witch, which means bender or weaver. And so people can relate to that word. But obviously, if we're talking about medieval times, to be called a witch would be an insult. To be called a witch, you would be, you know, if somebody called you a witch, they would have called you somebody who had sold their soul to the devil and renounced all, you know, everything good and that is pure, and then, of course, just renounce everything. So it wouldn't have been a good thing to have been called a witch. You know, the word witch wasn't a good word to call somebody back then. Even a white witch, people would have probably gone sick at you. Now, traditional witchcraft, what we have today, does take highly a lot from modern cunning, well, from older cunning folk practices. So, for instance, we have the rowan beads, we have horseshoes, we also have things like snail shells, hanging up. There are so many different charms, hagstones, that it can go on. We do a lot of older stuff that has occurred, blackthorn charms, stuff like that. It really does go on. It's not just in terms of charms, it's in terms of the spells. For instance, a lot of people will use to call up the horned god the Basque witch's charm. I'm really sorry if I've got that wrong, but that's a thing that's documented from the witch trials. That's the thing that people were said to have used to call the devil or to call the horned god. In regards to how we view the horned god, the idea that he is a devil, or the idea, not particularly the Christian devil, but a devil of witches, a devil of fae. You have to remember way back when devils were also known to be as fairies, so fae were also called devils. So to call something devil would also mean that you're calling it a fairy. It's something to do with the fae folk. Again, the fae are highly incorporated in traditional witchcraft, as again with the offerings that we give the fae, honey, milk, very traditional offerings. Not just, the offerings, but also you have to remember that there is a lot of stuff that we do. Yes, we're not Christian. The majority of traditional witches aren't Christian. However, I have met some that are Christian. And if you are Christian and you are a traditional witch, what I will say is you probably have more in touch with the older practices than anybody else. However, that's not to say that because something isn't old, it doesn't have power. That's not to say that at all. But what it is to say is that, you shouldn't call something traditional or really old craft if it's not. In my personal view, I do think modern traditional witchcraft has its roots in much older practices. And another thing as well is you have to remember that way back then, witches or cunning folk wouldn't have had this set tradition in what they practice in. It would have all been taken through the grimoires and seals and all the old grimoires. It would have been taken through that, as well as various herb lore and stuff like that. But for one person, something like dandelion would have had a completely different effect, magical purpose from somebody else who had dandelion. Oh, well, I use dandelion root to call up spirits. Oh, well, I use dandelion to grant wishes because you can blow the dandelion and make a wish and stuff like that. It depends, people would have practiced different. Another thing that we do know would happen was puppet magic, doll magic, used again in traditional witchcraft. In particular, some people use bread magic. That's really, really old. Bread puppets, bread dolls, very, very old. Seals, a lot of trad witches will use the seals from the old grimoires. Again, not something that was unfamiliar way back then. Flying ointment, poisons, the use of toxins, hallucinogenic herbs, pretty much documented down. Although some people say that the flying ointment was put there just to say that witches could stand all these terrible herbs because they were such horrible, horrible people. They could stand these poisonous herbs. Though it is known today that there are alkaloids involved in various chemicals and various toxins that are in those plants that I mentioned. Familiar spirits. Again, traditional witches have familiar spirits nowadays, and it's not an unknown thing. And I think if you practice witchcraft, you should have a familiar spirit, because it plays a massive part in witchcraft. And I think people not using familiar spirits or working with familiar spirits these days is... Not that I'm saying you can't call yourself a witch, because you can, but I think it's quite unbroken. I think it's quite broken away even from what witchcraft actually was, which was working with familiar spirits, which was having spirit helpers and friends that could help you. So, I do think that's a very big part of old world witchcraft. There are a lot of things that traditional witches do today that has connections, even from the tools that people use, the stang, the broom, witches' sweepers. Jesus Christ, that's really old. That's, I believe, 18th century. That goes, well, it's not like really, really old, but it's quite an old thing, you know. There's a lot of things that occur and a lot of things that happen that aren't just ripped off from Wicca. You know, it's not just ripping off Wicca, and it's not about that. And if you actually look closely and you actually read about the tradition, you will see that it takes from historical factors, it takes from a lot of historical figures, and the way the rituals work aren't a rip-off from Wicca. Some of them that I've seen are, and blatantly are, but you have to remember again, Wicca took from older things. So, you know, it's one of those, it's kind of chicken or the egg situation with it. But I do think that, you know, we're kind of obsessed with this whole idea that there's this authenticity or this unbroken lineage of witchcraft, and I think that's fine. But I do think that people, you know, in particular, I've had a couple of people that say, oh yes, it's a load of bull, it's just ripped off from Wicca. Well, if you actually look closely, if you actually read some books to do with traditional witchcraft, you will find that the majority of it actually isn't. It's not a rip-off from Wicca. You know, it does stem back to older things. What surprised me the most was the compass round. I did think that the compass round was just a rip-off of the circle, and that Robert Cochrane had created that just to kind of, you know, be like a rebellion to the circle, to be like, haha, fuck you. But it's not. It's in witch trials. This is documented stuff. This is documented things we have. Again, spirit flight, astral projection, stuff like that. That's something that occurs, and that's something that goes on even today, you know, and again, was a huge part of witchcraft. The soul travelling, the fetch, you know, the use of the words in which we use as well, fetch, magistella, you know. The beauty of it is that each trad witch will practice differently, but more or less, so I've heard a lot of people say, well, it's not a tradition if people are practicing differently. The layout in which people are practicing more or less is the same. Laying a compass round, treading a mill, like making spirit roads, calling up the horned one, old horny, and working with the Queen of Alpha May. And I'll go to them in a moment. But again, those things are a set in stone tradition of what you do, more or less. You know, working with familiar spirits, using old charms, that in itself is a tradition. That is a tradition, and it's not necessarily an unbroken line, but it does actually carry on from older things. So what I don't get is when people say that traditional witchcraft isn't actually a tradition. It is, because we have those things that are layouted. The rest of it, you can go and do your own thing. You know, you kind of have your own choice to do what you want. But those beginning parts and maybe the ending of a ritual and stuff like that, pretty similar. Now, in terms of Old Horny, again, was a name used in Scotland for the old witch chant. You know, sorry, tongue-tied. Old Horny was a name used for the devil by witches, again, from witch trials. Queen of Alpha May, Jesus, the Queen of Alpha May is steeped in folklore. You know, she's in folklore. There are stories about her as well that documents her and how she was. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. You know, the Queen of Alpha May is pretty old. You know, she stems back from Scotland, and she appears in Scotland, and not in the witch trials, but not just in the witch trials, also in folklore. You know, and the idea of travelling down to Alpha May through the compass round, that's documented. That is a documented thing. So I think when people say, oh, it's not as old as it is, rah, it's just stealing from Wicca, what I think people need to realise is, or just not even realise, just what I think people need to think about, is that the fact that you know, Wicca does take from older sources, and maybe it may be the other way around. Now, of course, I'm not saying modern traditional witchcraft is an unbroken chain of lineage that has occurred for years upon years upon years. I'm not saying that at all, and I admit there is Reconstructionalism in there, but I don't think there is as much Reconstructionalism as people think. I think there are things in there that are pretty old. The idea of flying to the Sabbat through the spirit, through the fetch, occurs today. Of using flying ointments still occurs. The idea of putting curses on people, healing people with older charms and old spells still occurs. The idea of hanging up hagstones and blah blah blah, and it goes on. Queen of Alphamay, the spirit world, the world of Fae, seeing the spirits and the Fae as the ancestors is a pretty old thing. It's a folkloric thing, and what a lot of traditional witchcraft today tends to do is take from folklore as well, so it looks into the folklore of the land. This video is rather long, but it's not particularly an event, but it's just some thoughts of mine that cross my mind. Obviously, as I said, I'm not saying this is an unbroken chain. It's, you know, I don't believe that to be the case. But what I am saying is, I do think there are things in there that aren't as Reconstructionalist as people would like to think. I do think there are things in older witchcraft that has, you know, that has ties to older things. I think there are things in there where it's quite old and it's quite ancient. So I think that's something for people to think about. I don't know, I'd like to hear people's views on it, but what really gets my goat on is when people start to think that modern traditional witchcraft is just a rip-off from Wicca. I don't think that's the point. I don't think that's the case as well. In fact, it may actually be the other way around. And if it is, you know, if there, and I do know in this modern day, there are some traditional witches that look, some of the rituals I've done, I've been like, this feels a lot like Wicca, you know. But again, maybe it is similar because there are influences in Wicca from older witch trials. For instance, the chant Rentum Tormentum in the Horned One's name, that's an old witch trial thing. The modern pagan thing we have, merry meet and merry part until we merry meet again, that's a Somerset witch trial quotation for saying goodbye to their spirits, still used today, even in Wicca. So I think people need to just think about the origins of certain things. And even in Wicca, there are a lot of things people do in Wicca that are you know, tied to older forms of witchcraft. This isn't a video that's saying, you know, we are mightier than you and all this shit. It's not about that, and I don't think, just because something is older, I don't necessarily think that makes it more powerful or anything like that. But just in terms of the origins, I do think that modern traditional witchcraft has quite a lot of ties. It takes a lot as well from the witch trials of Isabel Gowdy, who was a Scottish witch who was taken and spilt out a lot of information, but so much information people were like, oh, this is a bit freaky. She had a lot of very detailed, very intricate information. This could have been the ramblings of a mad woman, who knows, you know. But it is historical. The fact that it happened, the fact that people confess this, still shows as a thing it exists, and to carry that on shows that is a tradition. Even if it did start just from that confession, it still shows there is tradition there. However, that's not saying that I think traditional witchcraft today should be called traditional witchcraft. You know, I have different views on that, and I think that's for another video. But this is just to kind of solidify some of the things that I've been hearing and kind of set a few things straight. So yeah, and Cochrane did take some stuff from Wicca. He did. Some of the stuff he did take from Wicca. You can look at the rituals and be like, yeah, that happened. Though I tend not to do a lot of Cochrane stuff. A lot of my tradition I tend to do is Cornish witchcraft, and I find that for me, because modern Cornish witchcraft does take quite a lot from pellars of the early 19th century and 18th century, so there's a lot of stuff there that actually did happen by cunning folk and pellars and witches, and again, it takes from older sources. So yeah, but I do, that's where I stand on the whole situation. Anyway, long video, take care, peace out guys. It'd be good and interesting to hear your views on the subject.